On the night of August 8, 1963, the Great Train Robbery took place in Great Britain. According to a long-standing tradition, old banknotes from Scotland were sent for destruction to London, where they were rewritten and burned in an English bank. Therefore, once a month, another mail carriage was attached to the Glasgow-London train, containing bags of banknotes ranging from £1 to £5. These banknotes had already been taken out of circulation, but had not yet been rewritten, and they could easily be put back into circulation. Since ancient times, humanity has loved to surround criminals with a romantic aura. If the robber is not an inveterate murderer, then nobility is even attributed to him. Stories about righteous thieves and noble leaders of bandits have existed in all eras and among all peoples. The 20th century was no exception, except that in this century fame for cunning swindlers came not through oral tradition, but through the media. It was thanks to British journalists that the theft of money from a mail train on August 8, 1963, went down in history as the Great Train Robbery. A gang of criminals robbed a mail train and stole 120 bags of money worth £2,631,000. Today, the equivalent of this amount is approximately £46 million, $65 million, €54 million. The brains and main organizer of such a successful robbery was 31-year-old Bruce Reynolds, the son of a trade unionist and the mother of a nurse, who went downhill from a young age. By the early 1960s, he was part of a gang with the loud name Napoleon, which even had a robbery of a cash-in-transit van, but Reynolds wanted more. He dreamed of a crime that would instantly enrich him and at the same time glorify him. The first time he ended up in juvenile detention was at the age of 17, and then off he went. By the age of 30, he had been prosecuted 10 times for various crimes, in his youth for theft and robbery, then he retrained for theft of antiques. While serving one of his sentences, he heard from one of his cellmates, John Griffith, who was a minor employee of an English bank and who was suspected of fraud, a story about a mail carriage that transports millions of pounds once a month. Reynolds' cellmates shook their heads. Banknotes worth several £1,000,000 represented a tasty jackpot, but they considered robbing a train a completely impossible task. In Britain, in the 1960s, with developed means of communication, such impudence even for a criminal seemed sheer madness. A daring idea was born in Reynolds' head to rob such a train, but Reynolds saw this as his chance and understood that he would not be able to carry out the plan alone, nor as part of a group of 3 or 4 people. For half a year, Bruce Reynolds developed a plan for his crime and selected suitable people, giving preference to those who had been tested in joint robberies. He did not divulge anyone into the details, probably his accomplices did not point this out, and were ready to remain silent for the share of £100,000 each promised to them. As a result, he brought a whole team into the business. After being released and opening an antique shop as a cover, Reynolds began to develop a robbery plan. His closest assistant was an old friend in criminal matters, Douglas Goody. In total, Reynolds gathered 15 people for the raid. The roles were carefully distributed and rehearsed in advance. On the eve of the robbery on August 7, 1963, at about 6:50 p.m., a mail train carrying an additional carriage of money and valuables left Glasgow Central Station. One of Reynolds's people watched the departure, and when the train set off, he immediately reported by phone that in the carriage with the inscription Royal Mail and the number M324M there were 128 bags of banknotes. The train had 12 carriages and there were 72 postal employees sorting departures in the direction of travel. On August 8, at 3:03 a.m., all the robbers, dressed in overalls of railway workers, stood in pre-distributed positions. The driver, Roy James, was sitting a mile away from the scene of the attack in the cab of a truck at 3:25 a.m. Charles Wilson, at a signal from Reynolds, covered the green light with a black bag and turned the light red with a hand torch. To the north, from the signal tower, another member of the gang, John Delly, using the same flashlight, analyzed the warning yellow. The train began to slow down. the assistant driver jumped off the locomotive and went to the line telephone to find out what had happened. However, the telephone wires were cut in advance. The robbers first attacked the assistant, and then neutralized the driver Jack Mills by hitting him on the head. It was planned that after the seizure of the diesel locomotive, one of the criminals would lead it, for which purpose a former railway worker was brought into the gang, but he became so freaked out and nervous that he had to lift the bloodied Mills from the floor and force him to drive away the diesel locomotive. 2 carriages disconnected from the main train, to the Bratgubridge Bridge, where the rest of the robbers were waiting. The collectors who were in the carriage with the money did not notice the attack on the drivers. They also forgot to latch the door to their carriage. The raiders tied them up and took possession of all 120 bags of money. They forgot 8 bags in the heat of the moment. The truck was already waiting at the appointed place. In a few minutes the villains loaded bags of money into the back of the car, and fled the crime scene in 2 cars with false license plates. Soon they were at a rural farm, which, shortly before the day of the robbery, Reynolds had rented and turned into a headquarters. The villains had previously cut all telephone wires in the immediate vicinity, and the first reports to the police about the incident were received only at 4:20 a.m. According to Reynolds' plan, the bandit would spend several weeks after the robbery on the farm, disguised as agricultural workers, until the noise died down, but the crime was too big, bold, and noisy. For the British police, solving the robbery became a matter of honor. A large-scale search began within a radius of 50 kilometers from the robbery site. The police searched all the houses and buildings. After learning about this on the radio, the criminals left the farm on the 2nd or 3rd day, and just a few hours later the police showed up there. It was not difficult for them to find traces of the recent presence of a large group of people on it. After this, a thorough inspection was carried out with the involvement of experts, but it turned out to be all in vain. Even before leaving, the robbers wiped everything down, destroying fingerprints, but then the detectives were lucky. A worn board game, either Monopoly or something else, was found in the desk drawer. It was boring to sit locked up around the clock, especially since the leader Reynolds strictly forbade drinking and bringing women to the farm. Out of boredom, even thieves will sit down to play Monopoly or Lotto, and on the game there are fingerprints, which every single one was suitable for identification, and again, every single one was present in the police fingerprint file. So the detectives became aware of the names of the robbers. Large police forces were deployed to catch the criminals who committed the record robbery. Thousands of citizens contributed to the investigation, including those who were flattered by the reward of £10,000 promised for the capture of the criminals. In this situation, the Reynolds gang had no chance to escape responsibility. By January 1964, almost everyone was arrested. Only 3 remained at large: Reynolds, Edwards, and White, the leader of Bruce. Reynolds hid for 6 months waiting for a false passport, and having received it in a confusing way, under the name Keith Clement Miller, he reached Mexico, and from there he left for Acapulco. Then his wife Frances, under the name Angela, and son arrived there, and at the end of 1964, they were joined by Reynolds' accomplices, Buster Edwards and Charlie Wilson. On August 12, 1964, one of the convicted members of the Wilson gang escaped from prison, aided by a 3-man team that broke into the prison to rescue him, even though all the participants in the Great Heist were being held in a maximum security prison. From November 1965, Wilson was already in Mexico City, visiting old friends Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards, who went into hiding there 11 months later, in July 1965. Another participant in the robbery, Ronnie Biggs, also escaped from prison. The escape was planned by recently released prisoners, with the help of 2 other ex-convicts Leslie and Blake, with the support of Beek's wife, thus leaving the 5 robbers free. In 1968, Bruce Reynolds had already spent most of the loot. Under the name Keith Killer, he came with his family to London, and planned another big robbery. But while trying to contact his former accomplices, Reynolds came to the attention of the police, who were spying on some of them. On November 9, 1968, he was arrested and entered into a plea deal. Reynolds pleaded guilty to the grand robbery and, in exchange for law enforcement refusing to pursue his family, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In 1978, Reynolds was released and returned to criminal activity, transporting and trafficking drugs, and also engaged in money laundering. In 1980, he was arrested for amphetamine trafficking and sentenced to 3 years in prison. After his imprisonment, he settled down and, instead of crime, began to engage in creativity, and acted as a consultant for the film Buster, where he was played by the actor Maria Lemp. In 1995, he published an autobiographical book, The Autobiography of a Thief, The Man Behind the Great Train Robbery. In the book, Reynolds said that because of the Great Robbery, no one wanted to hire him for work, both legal and illegal, having lost a significant part of the funds due to confiscation and attorney fees. Since the 1990s, Reynolds has lived on benefits from a trust fund set up by his wife. On February 7, 2013, Reynolds died in his sleep. The trial of the arrested criminals began in January 1964. And on April 15, the trial ended, with the judge describing the robbery as a selfish, violent crime inspired by enormous greed. Of the 11 robbers who appeared in court, 7 were sentenced to 30 years in prison, the remaining 4 received shorter sentences, ranging from 3 to 24 years. Most of the stolen money was never found. The 15th member of the gang remained unknown. It was a postal worker who leaked information about the train schedule and the procedure for transporting money. Only Reynolds knew his name. Ronnie Biggs fled to Paris, where he acquired new identity documents and underwent plastic surgery. In 1970, he moved to Australia, where he founded a construction company. When Interpol became interested in him there, he fled to Rio de Janeiro, where Biggs could not be extradited, since there was no extradition treaty between the UK and Brazil. And besides, he became the father of a Brazilian son, who granted him the right to immunity. As a result, he lived openly in Rio for many years, safe from the British authorities, and in May 2001. At the age of 71, Biggs voluntarily returned to England, admitting that he might be arrested. He stated that he would like to go to the pub and, as an Englishman, buy a pint of bitter beer. Having been arrested, he was sent back to prison for the remainder of his sentence. On July 2, 2009, Biggs was denied parole, but on August 6, 2009, he was released from serving his sentence due to severe pneumonia and other health problems, and died in London on December 18, 2013. Charlie Wilson was killed in his Spanish villa. Allegedly he was connected with the drug mafia. The fate of the other robbers was different, since most of the money was never found. Apparently, the villains divided everything among themselves. Each dealt with their share differently. Some returned, in exchange for not getting caught and reducing their sentences. Some, having served their due time, disappeared from the sight of the police and perhaps still lives happily ever after.